Chapter 26. Someone Worthy. Henry reached the forest and dropped to his knees, heaving. His body was broken and his magic was spent. "Henry?" Irina knelt down beside him. Henry's face twisted in anguish. "They're gone. I couldn't save them." Irina's chin quivered. Henry held out his arms as if he were holding someone. He had been holding someone. "Navara," he stammered, looking into his empty hands. "She was taken." Then he looked up and saw Rowan's coffin lying on the forest floor. He crawled over to the precious box and opened the lid, but it was empty. Henry buried his face in his hands. "She's dead," Henry said. "Rowan's dead." At that moment, a wildly flapping raven crashed to the ground beside them. As it thrashed about, it turned into Davian Martikov, who was trying to extinguish the smouldering embers among his beard and clothes.
"Gosh dang, mother-jumping son of a muskrat!" he cried. "Those confounded druids and their confounded fire magic!"
Elvir ran up to him. "Father, are you all right?"
I'm fine.
The old man waved his arms.
"But the elves, they're gone. The devil killed one and took the other."
They all flinched when another bolt of lightning ripped across the sky and struck the crown of Yester Hill. Just as the peal of thunder was dying away, a mighty roar bellowed from the hilltop. They could see in the distance roots and branches bursting forth from the statue, something enormous taking shape. A giant, leafless tree blight emerged, leaving the statue an empty husk. The gaping maw of the unnatural tree opened wide in the middle of its trunk, and it roared again.
"We need to get out of here," Elvir said.
"Should we ditch the box?" He gestured to the coffin.
"No, damn it!"
Irina said, hoisting it up and tying it onto Snowflake's hindquarters.
"We're taking it with us."
Then she mounted, grabbing the reins. Herkomoid flew over to Henry's shoulder, and Henry heard the pseudo-dragon's agitated thoughts in his mind. "She's gone," Henry told him, and Herkomoid went into a tizzy of growling and crying.
"That blasted tree blight is heading for the winery," Davian said. "We need to get back there before it does."
"We need to get the children and flee to Kresik," Elvir said.
"Nonsense! We're standing our ground at the winery," Davian said.
"But we can't—"
"We are not abandoning our home, Elvir, and that's final."
Davian turned to Henry.
"I'm sorry I wasn't more help on the hill. I tried thinning their ranks with my crossbow, but there were too many."
"It wasn't your fault," Henry said, allowing Elvir to help him onto Snowflake. He sat behind Irina, hunched over her shoulder.
"It's not yours either,"
Davian replied. But maybe it is, Henry thought, recalling the smirk on Strahd's face after their agreement in the vineyard. So much for Strahd's honor. Elvir and Davian transformed into ravens, and Irina kicked Snowflake into a gallop. They needed to outrun that monstrous tree. Henry looked back to see a column of mountainfolk marching from the south along the road behind them, the tree blight at the column's head. Its writhing roots crawled along, almost swimming through the ground, like some kind of tentacled kraken from the deep. Throngs of smaller plant creatures were teeming from the woods to follow the abominable tree. Twig blights, vine blights, needle blights, blights of every kind were rallying to its calls. After 10 miles of hard riding and flying, they made it to the winery without Henry passing out. They could no longer hear the tramping of feet or the roaring of the tree, but the tribal army was surely not far behind. Irina helped Henry dismount as Davian and Elvir ran into the building. Henry leaned on Irina for support, while Herkomoid clung to the knight's shoulders. They were about to follow the Martikovs inside, when Henry saw someone approaching from the north. The lone figure was barely visible in the mist. "Wait," Henry whispered to Irina. He bent over and took a crossbow, sitting by the door. After Irina eased him to the ground, he put his foot on the stirrup and extended his good leg until the bowstring caught on the wheel nut. Then he loaded a bolt and leveled the weapon at the stranger. "Put your hands up and stay the fuck where you are," Henry shouted. The hooded stranger stopped, slowly lifting 2 hands in the air. Irina ran into the house. "Are you Henry Gibson?" the hooded stranger asked. "What is it to you?" "I'm Kazimir Velikov. I've been looking for you." Henry was puzzled. Casimir? Had he heard that name before? "I'm the elf who worked for Luvash from the Vistani camp," said the man claiming to be Casimir. Something shattered in the house, and a moment later Irina came back out with a broken shard of a mirror. "All right," Henry yelled to Casimir. "This is how it's going down. You're going to walk toward me very slowly, keeping your hands up." The hooded man did as he was told, and as he came closer, Henry recognized his face. "That's close enough," Henry said, when the man was 20 feet away. Irina turned her mirror on the stranger. He had a reflection. "Please," Casimir said. "I've come a long way to find you. I'm here to help you." Henry lowered the crossbow. "You're too late." Casimir gave a questioning look. Henry winced as he tried to move again. He looked at his leg and grimaced. A surgeon could not have sliced his hamstring with more precision. Casimir rushed over to the knight and pulled a wand from his cloak. "Hey!" Henry grabbed a dagger from his belt and held it to Casimir's throat. "It's all right," Casimir said, holding up his wand. "I want to help." Henry breathed heavily through gritted teeth, still dizzy and sick from Strahd's spell. "I am here to help." Henry lowered his dagger, and Casimir rested a hand on Henry's arm. The elf waved his wand, and the overwhelming nausea that had been gnawing at Henry since Yesterhill started to fade. Circles formed under Casimir's eyes, and the elf's dark complexion paled. "What happened to you?" Casimir asked, letting go. "I've only just taken some of your injuries." Henry's body relaxed, and the flesh around his wound knitted back together, but fatigue still lingered, and his leg was still useless. "Are you a healer?" Irina asked. "It's arcane magic," Casimir said. "I can only heal by taking maladies into myself. But tell me, what's happened? And where are the elves who were with you?" Henry looked over his shoulder at the coffin still strapped to Snowflake. "They didn't make it," he said. "Strahd laid an ambush for us," Irina said. Casimir frowned and shook his head. "It's always Strahd." Noticing Henry's gaze, Casimir stood and walked over to the wooden box. "There's only one coffin here." "That's Rowan's," Henry said, not caring to get up or explain. "Strahd took Navarra. He's probably turned her by now." He put his head in his hands and felt Irina's arm around him. "She was so beautiful," Casimir said after a moment. "Even in death. It's nice to see her one more time." Henry's eyes widened. He looked up and saw that Casimir had taken the lid off the coffin and was peering inside. "You can see her?" Henry got to his feet with Irina's help. He tottered over to the coffin and grabbed the lip. "Whiskers! Ha! You sneaky furball!" The druid was curled up in the child-sized box, eyes closed, but there was no blood, no mark on her neck, no indication that she had recently been killed. "Oh, Rowan!" Irina said. "Did I miss something?" Casimir asked. Rowan stirred at the sound of familiar voices. She opened her eyes and looked up to see Casimir. "Casimir?" she thought. The dusk elf stared at her in awe. Rowan sat up. Henry and Irina were there too, both beaming. And she was in her coffin, on top of Snowflake. They were at the Wizard of Wines. "Rowan, you're alive!" Irina said, putting a hand on her shoulder. "How do you feel?" Rowan licked her dry lips and rubbed her neck.
I have a headache.
She also felt thirsty, very thirsty.
Whiskers, you gave us such a scare,
Henry said. He looked like hell. Hercomoid hopped down from Henry's shoulders and curled into her lap, whimpering. The pseudo-dragon nuzzled her hand, and Rowan felt his thoughts in her mind. Fear, loss.
What's that?
Rowan asked the creature. His master was gone, taken.
No, not Navarra.
A roar carried on the wind from the south, followed by the blare of a ram's horn. Drums and marching feet shook the ground like distant but gathering thunder.
We need to get inside, Irina said.
Rowan jumped down, wondering how long she had been out, and ran with the others into the winery. The Martikovs were rushing about, boarding up windows, gathering weapons and preparing for war. Stefania handed her baby to her eldest son.
Take your siblings to the cellar, she told them,
then counted all the children as they hurried down a flight of stairs behind the vats of wine.
Rowan!
Elvire blinked at her as though he were staring at a ghost.
I'm here,
she said weakly. She still felt tired and very thirsty.
It's good to see you. Here.
He handed her a longbow.
Who are you?
Elvire asked the male elf standing beside Rowan.
I'm here to help too,
Casimir said. Davian, who had been distributing bushels of arrows with Adrian, looked to Henry and Irina for confirmation. After they nodded their approval, Davian said,
Well, I hope you know how to fight.
We need people with ranged weapons on the roof, Elvire said, going up the stairs.
And we need at least 3 people on the first floor to keep anyone from breaching the doors,
Davian said. Henry limped over to a window by the front door, dragging a chair behind him. There was a narrow gap in the boards covering the window, big enough for arrows to get through. I'll stay here, he said, sitting down and adjusting the crossbow.
I'm with you, Henry,
Irina said, and drew her sword from its sheath.
Someone's got to protect you now.
Adrian grabbed an axe and took up a position by the back door, while everyone else prepared to go to the roof. We're fighting things made of wood, Henry said, gathering a pile of bolts next to his weapon. Do we have pitch, tar, anything flammable?
Already on it,
said Dag, coming out of the storeroom carrying an iron brazier and a bucket of black viscous liquid. Stefania followed him with bundles of specially prepared arrows. Each one had a wad of cotton tied just below the arrowhead. Rowan took a handful of arrows. When a howl erupted again outside, louder this time, Rowan, Casimir, Elvire, and Davian ran to the rooftop and took their positions. Stefania and Dag came up behind them with the brazier and lit the coals within it. The air was filled with sounds of blowing horns and beating drums, and underlying this warlike clamour there was a subtler, more sinister noise, like the chirping of thousands of cicadas rising from the woods all around. The giant tree blights' leafless branches rose out of the fog like skeletal hands reaching for the winery.
Wintersplinter, Rowan said.
What?
Davian squawked.
The tree blight. That's what the druids called it. Wintersplinter.
Marching beside the awful tree came the mountainfolk. They were led by a druid with a black beard and a bear skin draped over his broad shoulders. Clutched in the druid's hand was a gnarled staff of twisted black brambles. He raised the staff above his head and shouted a druidic chant. An army of blights issued forth from the wood. Hundreds upon hundreds of the tiny monsters charged across the vineyard like an inexorable swarm of locusts. Only then was it clear that these blights were the source of the strange chirping.
Morning, Lord, help us,
Elvire said.
They really mean to finish us off this time,
Dag muttered.
Not if we can help it.
Davian knocked a flaming arrow to his bow. Rowan and the others did the same.
Loose!
Davian shouted. A volley of fire rained down on the enemy, disrupting the first wave of blights. Several creatures went up in flames, igniting others around them as they ran away, but the army continued to surge forward. The 6 archers on the roof released volley after volley, setting fire both to the blights and to the vineyard. "Here they come!" Stefania cried, as twig blights, some as small as cats, and others large as elves, rushed at the winery's walls. They tore at the wood paneling, trying to pry it apart. Human warriors followed, smashing at the walls with axes. The were-ravens let loose arrow after arrow. Thwack, thwack, thwack. Stefania and Elvir especially hit their marks with deadly accuracy. Rowan was shooting too, but each of her arrows seemed to veer off. It had been a long time since she had used a bow. Beside her, Casimir put down his bow and lifted a wand. A bolt of lightning arced out from its tip, striking a swath of blights and men. Rowan gaped. "Are you some kind of sorcerer?" "Wizard," he said, then flicked his wand, and another bolt streaked out to consume a group of monsters below. Rowan aimed another flaming arrow at a blight, but again the shot went wide. "Screw it! I need magic, not this!" Rowan shook the longbow. Her staff had been lost at Yester Hill, and without a focus she could not properly cast spells. "Would this help?" Casimir held out an opaline crystal. Rowan took it. "This is an arcane focus, not good for druidic magic." 200 yards away, the tree blight roared, picked up a boulder the size of a man, and hurled it at the winery. "Look out!" Casimir called, pushing Rowan aside as the boulder smashed into the roof. Rowan and Casimir looked down into the central hall of the winery, through the newly made hole. One of the fermentation vats had burst, spilling wine everywhere. On the roof, the were-ravens loosed a volley of arrows at the tree blight, but every shot fell short, striking the ground about 100 feet shy. "We're doomed if we can't get to that tree," Rowan thought. She rolled the crystal in her hand, took a deep breath, and said the words to conjure fire. A tongue of flame leapt in her palm. It was good enough. She set down the bow and jumped off the main roof onto the stable roof, then hopped to the ground as graceful as a cat. A twig blight charged at her, but she blasted it with fire. Her magic was hard to control with the crystal. She would have to ride it like an untamed horse. Rowan ran at Wintersplinter with one hand clenched around the crystal, the other outstretched, incinerating anyone and anything that stood in her way. Blights ignited to her left and right, flaring like tinder. A wild woman dodged through the flames and raised an axe to strike at Rowan, but a bolt of lightning stopped the warrior mid-swing. The magical electricity hit her chest and sizzled down her body until she dropped over, dead. Rowan looked back to see Casimir with his wand raised. He rushed to her side to make sure she was unhurt. Then Wintersplinter bellowed, and another rock soared over their heads to smash into the winery. "Come on!" Rowan yelled at Casimir, and they charged across the vineyard toward the tree blight.
"What is she doing?"
Henry yelled, as he shot a bolt from his crossbow, hitting another warrior that rushed up to the door.
"Whiskers is going to get herself killed. Again!"
Henry loaded another bolt, leveled his weapon, and shot. Another tribesman fell. "If she dies," Irina said, "hopefully she'll come back again." 10 feet away, a rock smashed through the wall, leaving a gaping hole. Henry cursed. "That tree blight's going to bring the house down upon us." Before the debris had time to settle, a mountain man came leaping through the gap. Stepping back, Irina parried the man's spear and dispatched him with a slash across his belly. He crumpled to the ground. 2 more tribesmen climbed over the rubble, but Irina's blade cut them down one by one. "Irina, watch out!" Henry said. She jumped aside just in time as a flurry of jagged icicles came whizzing through the gap and drove like arrows into the wall behind her. Druids were beginning to cast spells in on them.
Henry shouted to the man at the other end of the winery. "Adrian, what's happening over there?"
"They're trying to bust through the door," Adrian shouted back.
"They've already broken through on this side," Irina said, as two blights came crawling through the wall. Henry cursed and staggered to his feet, drawing Apollo and casting the crossbow aside. Pain shot up from his leg. The world darkened, and he almost swooned. Henry knew he did not stand much chance in a fight without the use of his leg, but he could not sit by while Irina faced the onslaught alone. One of the blights rushed at Henry, scratching his armor with its wooden claws. But a flick of Apollo's blade split the creature in half. The other blight, a nimble vermin, jumped on Irina's head and tore at her hair. Irina spun around, slamming into one of the great wine vats. There was a crunching sound, and when the blight fell to the floor, Irina chopped it to bits with her sword. More blights piled in through the breach in the wall. Henry and Irina stood side by side, their blades rising and falling against the unremitting flood of wooden monsters. Soon a heap of their brambly bodies were stacked like cordwood at the feet of the two swordsmen. But more blights kept coming. Henry's head spun, and he knew they could not hold out much longer. "Whiskers, you better know what you're doing," he thought. "And you better stay alive." Lightning flashed all around as Casimir waved his wand. Though the human warriors recoiled from his magic, the maddened plant creatures came on undaunted, no matter how many of their number were scorched by crackling bolts of energy. From the sky above, a were-raven in hybrid form swooped down and split a vine blight with his axe. It was Elvir. "I've got your backs," Elvir shouted, as he chopped away another blight. Rowan closed her eyes and extended her hands. She felt the power of the valley rising up from the ground into the crystal she held. This was her land, her homeland. When she opened her eyes, a wall of fire burst from her hands in a straight line toward the tree blight. Then she spread her arms, and the wall split into two blazing curtains. As they opened, they ripped a corridor through the horde of blights, like the seam of a garment being torn apart. Into this corridor Rowan stepped. With flames billowing on either side, she went forth against her terrible opponent. The giant unnatural tree opened its mouth wide, shining a green light from within, and gave a roar that toppled grapevines all around. Then it charged at the white-haired elf between the leaping curtains of fire. "Come at me, Wintersplinter," Rowan muttered under her breath. The earth quaked, but Rowan did not flinch. She raised the crystal above her head and called upon the spirits of the elements. Right before the monster's branches could reach out to touch her, Rowan spoke a word, and the flames around them imploded upon the tree blight. A firestorm whirled up its trunk, consuming bark, devouring branches. The tree flailed about in a frenzy as a wind from Rowan's hand stoked the blaze into a raging inferno. Within moments, the entire monstrosity was engulfed. It swayed on the spot, charred branches falling from its trunk, until finally Wintersplinter came crashing to the ground. Rowan squinted as a gust of smoke blew in her eyes. She lowered the crystal. Just when she was turning around, smack! A wave of water knocked her off her feet, dousing the flames on the burning tree. Rowan coughed and looked up to see the druid with the gnarled staff glaring down at her. His bearded face was streaked with blue paint. Not waiting for him to cast another spell, Rowan transformed into a wolf and lunged at the druid. As she slammed into the man's chest and knocked the staff from his hand, he too transformed into a beast. Now an enormous brown bear was battling with the white wolf, growling, clawing, biting, scratching. A loud boom rang in the air, causing both druids to look up. Casimir was standing only a few paces away, with the gnarled black staff in both hands. It was broken in half. One by one, every blight across the field, from the woods to the winery, dropped lifelessly to the ground. The bear let out a roar, and as he lifted his head, Rowan sprang at his throat. He lurched back, trying to break free from the wolf's jaws. But she held on. The taste of blood gave Rowan a renewed sense of strength. She would not let go. The bear's thrashing became weaker, and when the dying druid turned back into his true form, Rowan felt frail human bones crunching between her teeth. He was dead. Still a wolf, Rowan walked up to Casimir and sniffed the broken staff in his hands. "Gulthias wood," he said, tossing the two pieces aside. "That's where tree blights come from." Seeing that their army had been reduced to so much brushwood, the remaining mountainfolk fled. Elvir landed on the ground, turning into a human. He walked over to the fallen tree blight and rummaged about in the smoldering coals. There, in the middle of its trunk, he found a glowing green gem. Rowan became an elf. She licked her dry lips, then took a long draught from the water skin at her belt. But even after she had guzzled every drop, she was still thirsty. Then she heard something strange. Wind blew up from the south, stirring her wet hair, and with it came the rumbling of a voice Rowan had heard before. It was the same voice that had called to her from one of the cairns at Yester Hill.
"Long have I slumbered in the mountains," the voice said. "Long have I awaited one who is worthy to take my spear. Come, Druid of the hills. Come,